today is John Vespasian, and he is the author of 10 books on rationality, including Rationality is the Way to Happiness, The Philosophy of Builders, and the 10 Principles of Rational Living, among many others. And I'm happy to have you on today, John. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks for having me on, Nicholas. I started to write books about personal development and history, which is a rare combination, about 10 years ago. And what I do in my books is something I think rather unusual, because I go through dozens and dozens of biographies from very successful people and sometimes very unsuccessful from different centuries. And I try to draw lessons, to draw principles that we can apply in the 21st century right now. And the common thread of the books is rational living. So I really focusing very much on rationality, on trying to think ahead, trying to prevent problems, and not so much enthusiastic about positive thinking and this kind of stuff. I try to focus on facts, to draw practical principles that are very realistic, very much achievable.
Okay, great. And I always teach that, as humans, one of the best things that we do is pattern recognition. So it sounds like you go back, read biographies, go through history, and all you're doing is you're seeing patterns between successful people and people that have failed, and you're able to teach those patterns now, correct?
Yeah, each book focuses on a specific type of patterns. For instance, the latest book is called Undisrupted, and it focuses on how to deal with disruptions. There are other books focusing on, for instance, on stress, how people avoid stress successfully. And why I'm using history instead of theory or psychological theory? Because in my experience, people learn much more from stories, from anecdotes, from actually watching what other people are doing and getting results. We learn from stories much more than from theory. I mean, you can draw theory out of, psychology, personal development, marketing, personal finance. You can draw theories. But actually, when you hear a story which is really compelling and you see people making mistake after mistake and really destroying their lives, and then you see, my God, I'm really doing the same thing. And then people really get it. Otherwise, it's very much empty talk. And really, I started to write books 10 years ago about personal development out of sheer frustration. I have to tell you, I've been reading books about personal finance, personal development for decades. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, I was really fed up because I could not find practical advice. It's very fluffy. Most of the things you get very much impractical. And I wanted to read books based on history, based on facts, based on real people. And this is what I started to do. I would like someone else to do it because writing books is really a lot of work. But right. Nobody else seems to be interested in this kind of stuff. So I'm just doing it myself.
Yeah, and I found the same thing. And obviously our brain is not adapted to be inspired by statistics. It's the stories that create the changes because we're emotional beings. And I agree in a lot of the personal development stuff, it can be fluffy. And my goal is to bring stories and very specific changes, whether it's body language or language patterns, to give people really specific tools and they know when to apply them. Tell us exactly how you define rationality.
Yeah, I try to define rationality as the way we use intelligence, human beings. You mentioned pattern recognition. I think it goes, it starts with language, and then you integrate patterns in a very abstract way in science. You integrate behavioral patterns, we integrate ethical patterns. Most of the time we do this unconsciously. But what you see when people are rational, what they do is really to use abstractions, to use principles, to use stories to prevent problems or to solve problems. You mentioned emotions. And one thing I do in my books is really to underline that emotions are useful because they make immediate evaluations of facts, of threats. But you have to check emotions against facts, against reason. Because if you make the decisions purely on emotions, it's very dangerous. I can tell you one of the stories of the book, a few stories, because they show, I think, in practical terms, what is behind. For instance, where I got the idea from the book, I was reading 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I was reading the biography of Sava Mamontov. He was a great industrialist in Russia. He built a great part of the Russian railroads in the 19th century. He was the Russian equivalent of Andrew Carnegie, maybe in the UK, Stephenson. I mean, he built a great company. And the story is very compelling because when he was in his 40s, he was on top of everything. He was very successful, a celebrity. He had a huge art collection, several houses. I mean, he really was one of the 1% celebrity in the country. And within a few years, he lost everything because he started to improvise. He wanted to expand his business. He started to build steel mills, something he didn't know anything about. But he thought that, okay, I can run a railroad. I can make steel. And he was completely wrong. I mean, it's a completely different business. He started to lose money. And then he started to use the money from the railroad to pay for the losses in the steel mills. And his shareholders were very unhappy with that. So he got sued. He got prosecuted for embezzlement. Eventually, he didn't go to jail. It was a very much public trial. It was on the front page of the newspapers for a year. And eventually, he lost everything. He lost his wealth. He lost his art collection, his houses. And for the last 13 years of his life, he was ostracized by his friends. Nobody wanted to talk to him. He was living in total misery and loneliness. And I found the story fascinating because Mamontov was extremely intelligent. Mm-hmm. He was highly educated. He could speak not only Russian, but also English and French. I mean, he was really a very educated, highly educated, sophisticated person, but he destroyed his life within a few years. And it's the same pattern you see today when you see a movie star and he makes money for a decade making movies, and then he loses everything in some stupid investment in restaurants or whatever. It's the same pattern. You see in sportsmen, in basketball players, and they lose everything they accumulated in a decade, and then they lose it in some stupid investment. Is the same pattern. And the lesson I draw from the book, from history, the lesson is obviously the same. One of the principles, the main principles in the book, people who deal very successfully with disruptions, they rely on what they already know. They fall back on their basic skills, on their territory, their friends, something they know very well. People who destroy their lives when they deal with disruptions like Mamontov, these are people who improvise. And this is one of the main lessons from the book. If you want to avoid these kind of mistakes, do not improvise. When you have a problem, face the problem, but do not start believing you can do anything.
So this is really about sticking kind of to your core competencies, having systems in place and doing what you're good at instead of maybe having your emotions pull you into something else where you do it for maybe the wrong reasons, or you want recognition, you want, maybe it's ego driven. So you use the word disruptions a couple times. And how do you define disruptions?
Well, in the book, I'm using the term disruption as a generic term, covering business disruptions, health problems, because I also deal with a lot of examples, people going through severe sickness or severe discapacity. Disruptions also in terms of finances, people who go bankrupt, lose everything. So it's a very wide use of the term disruption. I focus mostly on severe disruptions, and I go through different centuries with really a lot of biographies, short biographies, trying to explain how people sometimes do very well and sometimes they destroy their lives in a very, when you look at it in retrospective, it seems very easy.
Right.
But we all have this tendency to improvise, to try new things. You get it all the time in the media. Just do it. Just do it. Seems to be a religion almost nowadays. And you see people doing very stupid things with a lot of confidence. They are extremely cocky and say, I can do anything. And then, they just break a leg and they do stupid things. So look at history, learn from history. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. It's the cheapest, the most effective way to learn, to read these stories. And when you read the stories, you get the patterns very quickly.
So let me ask you this though, when, often we look at the pioneers in something, someone who's really changed the world, they've put themselves out there, they've tried something new. Maybe they just took imperfect action, failed forward, and were able to create something from that. So does that fit within your model?
It does fit to an extent that I propose a slow evolution. When you go through, hundreds of biographies, and you look at the outliers, and you see, okay, this guy made $1 million in 5 days because whatever. This is not a reliable pattern, because it can happen from time to time. You see, typically in movies or this kind of stuff, you see these kind of stories. But when you look at data from history, this doesn't match. What I really recommend in the book for innovation, for career development, is an organic evolution. And let me just give you an example.
Sure.
One of the stories I tell in the book is the biography of Joseph Paxton, who was a gardener in the 19th century, and he evolved to become a very successful architect. The story is fascinating because the guy didn't go to school, he didn't have any connections, he got, he could barely speak standard English because he had a heavy accent. It's really fascinating. He evolved this is for me, one of the best examples of how to be innovative and successful with low risk. And he started to experiment. He got a job when he was 14 years old as a gardener, and then he became a head gardener. He started to build glass houses for exotic plants. Eventually, at the beginning he was really bad, but eventually he built a few ones. He developed some expertise. Then he started to write articles for newspapers about glass houses. So through little by little, he learned a new skill. He developed this expertise. It took him 15 years. And eventually, when there was a call for tender, a call for ideas to build in Hyde Park in London, a building for the Universal Exhibition, he proposed a big glass house. He submitted a proposal. He won, and he was able to build it ahead of schedule, within budget, and a building that was supposed to last for 6 months eventually was used for 30 years. So it was extremely successful. This guy was a simple gardener, but he found the way, little by little, to evolve, to innovate. And nowadays, you see the structures designed by Paxton, they are used very often for large buildings, for train stations. But what is fascinating in this kind of career, and this is something that you can reproduce. I don't think you can reproduce the stories of people who become rich overnight or become famous overnight, because these are just coincidence. But careers like Paxton's, they're good examples, because you see people find their way little by little, exploring. You see it took him 15 years because he didn't have a clear opportunity. It took him a while to develop different skills, to learn to write, because he learned to write for newspapers. He got some contacts in the media. So eventually he built himself the opportunities, and he became very wealthy and very successful. But this is, for me, the best example to be innovative. You develop skill, you find opportunities, and the risk is very low. What I never recommend in my books is people just to jump before they look. This is stupid. This is pure emotional driven psychology. I think is suicidal. It's a pity that when you watch movies, seems to be the driving message nowadays. I think this is an explanation why there are so many depressed people nowadays, because they have this idea that these outliers, these extremely unusual situations, they are normal. And then when they don't get it, they become depressed. And I think there is a wave of irrationality, which is very dangerous, because then people become passive, they become dependent on medication. It's much better to look at history, to know what is possible, to know what is a good strategy, and to follow it, because it has been proven through the centuries.
Yeah, I think that's a great story because we live in such a culture of instantaneous satisfaction, and the only people we see, or at least the only perspective we see, is people's instantaneous success in driving Lamborghinis, and we forget that success comes from doing every day the things that need to be done, progressing, innovating in your sphere of influence and what you're good at, making maybe smaller failures and adjusting and correcting course, correct? Instead of, I think we gamble a lot. We see somebody has had this success and we just dive in emotionally thinking we're going to get it too. And then we experience the failures. Our life doesn't match our blueprint. We feel depressed. Yeah, that's a great story. Does that kind of sum it up?
Yes, but I would like to comment as well on the question of positive thinking, because
Sure.
Whenever I get interviewed, some people say, "Oh, you're very negative. You're very realistic, very factual. What about positive thinking? What about positive thinking?" And I really devoted a whole chapter of the book to show when positive thinking works and when it doesn't. And I think it's super important to drive this point home because people are very confused about this. When you look at the history of positive thinking, and actually the person who created it, who was a Frenchman, who was a pharmacist in the 19th century, his name was Emile Coué.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, when you look at the story and how he did it, because the guy was a scientist. I mean, he was a pharmacist. He had a pharmacy in a small town in France, I don't remember, Tracy, I think. And this guy, he was very curious. He wanted to grow his business. He didn't know how to do it. So he found in the newspaper, he read an advertisement for a course on hypnotism. And he had to close his pharmacy actually for a week, to travel to another place to take this course. He took this course and then returned, and he started to use suggestion because he wanted to apply the teachings from the course to his business. So he started to provide the medication. Well, actually, in the 19th century, most medications were herbal preparations. So he gave his herbal preparations to the patients. He told them a story about how they are going to recover, and said, "Look, if you take this twice a day and you stop eating whatever, within 2 weeks you will feel better." And then he told them a very colorful story. And what is amazing about Emile Coué is that he kept the statistics. When he started to use this suggestion in a very soft way, it was really experimental, but he kept the statistics, people who recover, how long they take to recover, and he became extremely successful. I mean, it was a fact that by using positive thinking, suggestion, people recover much faster. And what was the explanation? Because the guy was a scientist and said, okay, why is this working? And why this work was, this is because when you apply suggestion, you apply positive thinking to rational behavior, in this case, taking the medication, changing their lifestyle. I mean, they have to follow his recommendations. So the purpose of this positive thinking was to actually to reinforce positive behavior, rational behavior, to actually motivate people to do something useful. Not just to tell them you're going to get better just because you're going to get better, which is nonsense. But he actually, because you see, when people get medications, very, very often they will not take them or they will forget. He motivated his patients so much that they took these preparations religiously, and very, very often they recover. And then for the rest of his life, because he retired, he made a fortune actually from his pharmacy, and he retired in his 50s. And he spent the last 15 years of his life giving advice about positive thinking. So the story is true. I mean, it works if you put it together with rational action. If you put it together with irrational action or with basically with fantasy, it's nonsense. It will never work. It's distractive. So yes, positive thinking can be used for good. It can be very useful, but it has to be done, has to be exercised together with rational action.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people forget that, right? And they just they want to change their mindset and not take that rational, calculated action and do the work that's necessary to succeed. They often want to shortcut. So that's a great story. I know Emile Coué, and his affirmation every day in every way, right? I'm getting better and better. So he's the one that came up with that. But you also have in your book a chapter on not listening to the prophets of doom, right? So not just, maybe the positive thinking has to be applied with action, but also not listening to all of the negativity in the news that's around us, right? How do you apply that?
Well, today, I mean, yes, right now, when we have this coronavirus, and then we have this absolute hysteria about the environment and the planet is going to be destroyed, apparently in I don't know how many years. I mean, it's really another fever that you have in the Middle Ages with the Inquisition, and people believe that the world was going to end on the year 1000. I mean, you have this massive exaggeration of problems that the media is pushing because, okay, for them is their business just to promote, to actually publish negative news. But one of the messages you get in the book from going through really a lot of stories is that, okay, this is not new in society. I mean, today you get it on Twitter or you get it on your news feed, but in the Middle Ages, in the 19th century, it was exactly the same.
Thomas Malthus, right? Malthusian. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, you get very close societies, and sometimes people were very much pressured by their neighbors to do stupid things. So it has always been like this because human nature, I mean, we are emotional, we are suggestible. Sometimes we act because we feel pressure to do something. And one of the great lessons from history, from going through these biographies, is that in those situations, you have to take a step back and you have to think about probabilities, and you have to see, okay, this story, is it really so scary as it looks? What is really going to happen? And you have seen with the coronavirus, I mean, the stock market went down, I don't know, 8% or 9% in some areas within 2 days. And then it had recovered extremely quickly when people started to realize it was really not so awful. And now we are back again. So it's always the same in history. I mean, you have to really look at disruptions and compare them with similar cases and realize that things like this coronavirus, okay, we had viruses a few years ago. It was always the same story. And within a few weeks, usually people find the cure, they find the solution. And it's the same with the environment. People will eventually find technologies that reduce emissions, whatever. You don't have to panic. Panic, improvisation, passivity, this is the worst you can do. Look at history and learn that you have to remain calm. You have to take a step back and try to find the same solutions that people have been using in the last hundreds of years.
Right, and I was referring to Thomas Malthus, and his Malthusian point of view is that I think with a couple million people on the earth, all the resources of the earth would be tapped out, and people would start dying because of that. And so obviously that has proven incorrect, and that was way back in the 1700s, and look where we are now. So how do we make ourselves immune to this type of disruption? What can we do? What may be some habits, perspectives in our life that can give us that resiliency?
Yeah, there are different strategies. I'm going to mention a few ones. One of the main drivers, and you see in people who are very, very much stable through their careers, is that they apply systematic fragmentation to their activities. And let me explain this for a second because it's not self-evident. When you look at, for instance, the career of Robert Stephenson, he was building railroads in the United Kingdom in the 18th century. He spent his whole life building railroads between cities, and a few times he almost lost everything because he got the projects were late, and he started to lose a lot of money. And he was almost going bankrupt in one situation. And then he realized when he was in his 30s that when you are dealing with high-risk projects, and you have to deal with a lot of unknown factors, what you have to do is to really isolate the risk and to fragment your activities. And when he started to do that, he created a different company for each project. So he separated the risk. And in his own life, because you have to realize that this guy was under a lot of stress. I mean, he has to deal with delays in projects, have to deal with shareholders, have to deal with the press, have to deal with the UK Parliament. I mean, he was under high stress, and he was a very visible person. What he did, Stephenson, and this is something that I really recommend in the book, to reduce your level of stress and to become not immune, but almost immune to disruptions, you have to plan your activities and to plan your business, your social life, your health in a way that is you are diversifying the projects you work on, diversifying your sources of food, diversifying the types of friends you have. Because if you have proper diversification and fragmentation, you render yourself very much immune to risk. Because what happened a few times to Stephenson is that one of his projects went south. He started to lose money. So eventually he declared bankruptcy in one of his companies, but the other companies continue to work. And it's the same when you have friends. If you have 20 friends and then one of them dies, or you have a fight or whatever, you still have 19 or you have 18 and your life continues. And if you have different skills and you lose your job, you can find another job, you can change your career, you can do something else. But if you only have one skill and you rely on your own skill and then it becomes replaced by a computer, by artificial intelligence, then you're lost. So one of the drivers of the book from the stories is that you have to try to diversify and to fragment your activities in different boxes, in different areas, to render yourself very resilient. Just because you know to do one thing and you have some savings, don't you think that you're 100% immune? It is not the case. Even if you have relatively modest savings, you still should diversify. Try to put some money in Europe, try to put some money in the US, try to put some money in other countries. It's very inexpensive and very easy to do. It requires a little bit of initiative. But one of the lessons from history to deal with disruptions is that you need to diversify, you need to isolate the risk, because it makes you very, very strong, very, very strong.
Yeah, and I think, most of us have grown up thinking that that's something we should do in our investments. I don't know how many of us do it, but that we should be in stocks and bonds and real estate and cash and precious metals and, a variety of investments. But I like that perspective on doing that through your whole life as well, having different groups of friends, having different skills, maybe having different houses around the world, whatever way to diversify just adds stability. And I think that's a great takeaway. So you have a chapter 10 on thinking on your feet. And it says here, one of the captions is a formula that always works to your advantage. So I'm curious, what is that formula for thinking on your feet?
Yeah, this chapter is devoted to a great chess master, Capablanca, who was Cuban. And he lived in the US for most of his life. And Capablanca, he was, we're talking about the 1930s, 1940s. Capablanca was one of the best players on simultaneous games. I don't know if you've seen this this grandmaster play against maybe 100 people. And they put tables around and they walk around and they play on each board for a minute, and then they move to the next. And Capablanca was one of the great players in history, simultaneous games. He was able to win 98%. And he spent sometimes less than a minute to take a look, and then he moved to the next one. And people ask him, how could you think so fast on your feet? Because even for a grandmaster, it is very difficult to do that. I mean, nowadays in the 21st century, you don't see it so often because it's so difficult. Huh? And Capablanca had a clear strategy, which I found very intriguing and very practical, because you can apply it to anything. He had the idea that you can make quick decisions, and most of the time correctly, if you look at the end game. When you're playing chess, the end game means when you simplify the position after a few moves and you remove most of the pieces, but the structure remains, the structure of the position. And this idea of thinking quickly on your feet when you are under pressure, when you're in a crisis, try to think of the end game, where you want to go, what you want to do, what is the structure of the current situation, really what is underlying the problem. This allows people to make accurate decisions most of the time. I mean, it's not 100% reliable, But when you're dealing against situations, they are facing situations that are very dangerous, and you have to react very quickly. The strategy of Casablanca, and I really go into great detail in the book how he did it. The strategy of simplifying in your mind and looking at the big factors, at the big problems, and thinking about the end game is extremely effective, and anybody can learn it very quickly.
Yeah, that's great. And just keeping that focus on the end goal helps guide our decisions. And if you don't know what you want in the end, how can you act, in the present moment? You don't know which direction to go. And I think a lot of people face indecisiveness because they don't have that end in mind. So that's a great perspective and tying in the chess game there. So last thing, and we can start wrapping up, but you have in your book, you talk about the Cathedral Builders in the Middle Ages. So I want to hear that story and what we can learn from the Cathedral Builders.
Well, this is a fascinating comparison, because today, you see, we're in the 21st century, and people have smartphones, and they have, tablets and electric cars and all this kind of stuff. And they still worry. They worry that, okay, I'm not going to make it, it's too difficult, blah, blah, blah. And you have this constant stress and anguish and fear. And when you look at the cathedrals, and they were built, more than 1,000 years ago, in the 11th, 12th century. So like 1,000 years ago, 900 years. And they were built with extremely low technology. People who work in these sites, they could barely speak the language because they spoke 8, 9 different languages. They could not read, so you could not actually give written information. They could not work outdoors in the winter because it was extremely cold. Mm-hmm. It's possible. They were really -5, -10, and they had no possibility to work outside. So they have constraints that were impossible to imagine nowadays. And they build the cathedrals. And I found the story fascinating because how do they do it? And it was one guy actually who discovered how to do it, because the technology was available already for hundreds of years, but nobody knew how to solve all these problems together. And it was a monk, his name was Suger, who developed a management system to actually deal with all these kind of disruptions and to be able to build the cathedrals relatively quickly. We are talking about 10 years, 15 years, which is nothing. And with very few people, with 200, 250 people. So I go into his technique in the book in great detail, but just to summarize quickly what he did, what Suger realized is that when you have to deal with a very uncertain environment, and he had to deal with all these language problems, logistic problems, communication problems, transportation problems. It was really horrible. He could not actually foresee all the solutions at the beginning because he didn't know enough. Sometimes you have to go through the learning curve. Suger was clever enough to realize that he could not actually plan all the problems. But what he realized is that there was a way to do it, to reduce disruptions, and it's the following. He designed his work method, in this case, how to coordinate these 200 people, 250 people, in a way that he could make progress every day, even if there was a huge problem. For instance, just to give you a quick example. One of the problems that you have when you are working with 250 people in the Middle Ages, that it was very cold in the winter, is that you hire the people in May, they work until September, and then they leave because you cannot work in the winter. These kind of disruptions, Suger realized very quickly it was impossible to do anything because it was too difficult. So he created a system that allowed people to work every day of the year, even if it was freezing. So the first thing he did to build the cathedral was not to build the cathedral. He built houses for the workers so that they could spend the winter cutting the stones, and then they spend the summer putting the stones on the wall. And in this way, for the first time in history, they were able to work in continuous flow. And the takeaway from this story of the cathedrals, there are many more details, but just I'm just summarizing. The takeaway is that when you don't know what to do because you don't have enough information, don't you worry. What you have to do is to make every day some kind of progress. And this is what Suger did. When he could not work outside, he worked indoors. When he could not get sufficient stones, he would work on the designs. When he could not do one thing, he would do the other. But every day, he made some progress. And this is super important when you're doing some kind of business, you want to start a company, you want to develop your career. There are going to be periods where you don't get any visible progress because you don't find the new job or you don't find the investors, whatever. What you have to do every single day is to keep developing your skills, to keep developing your, I don't know what, mailing list, to keep developing your business plan, to keep working on the project so that you feel and you see in practical terms that you are moving, even if the movement is very, very small. This is a way to do it, because if you become passive and you give up and say, okay, I will never build the cathedral, it's too difficult, then it's very difficult to resume. And this is why many people go through depression, because at a certain point they just give up. They don't realize that progress is never smooth. And to build the cathedrals, they went through financial crisis, they went through wars, they went through all kinds of problems, but eventually they built the cathedrals. And once they did the first one, they copy-pasted all the others, and basically all the cathedrals in Europe are a copy of the first one built by Suger.
Wow, yeah, progress, is one of the keys to happiness and fulfillment, I think. And so at least making some progress every day, despite the disruptions, is a great takeaway for the audience. Well, John, it's been awesome having you. Is there anything else, any other stories, anything that you want to share, patterns of success and overcoming disruptions or rational living that you want to leave us off with?
Yeah, I just want to give to pass an idea that I think if people remember just one thing from today's interview, is that when you have to make important decisions, or you have to really, I don't know, to get married, to decide your career. I mean, really, what is really critical decisions. In order to prevent mistakes and to reduce your level of stress, you have to look at things with the perspective of a lifetime, which is not 5 years, it is not 3 years, it is not 10 years, it's going to be 80, 90 years. And when you use this perspective, your chances of making good decisions, accurate decisions, they are much higher. And one of the reasons why people today, they become so anxious or stressed is because their vision is very much short term. And they worry that, I don't know, they lost a job, and they look at the next week and they don't have a job. Yeah, but if you look at the perspective, at the problem with the perspective of a lifetime, you are going to live 90 years, it's a joke. I mean, within a few months, you will have another job, and then you will forget about it. So use the right perspective, and you make better decisions, you become more rational, and you will do much better. And this is one of the big lessons from history.
I think that was a great message for me today, and I'm sure many of our listeners will benefit from that as well, as we get so caught up in our instant satisfaction culture, and keeping that long-term perspective, I think is definitely a great way to make more rational decisions and keep moving forward in life, right? So John, it's been amazing having you. I've definitely learned some lessons here. For our listeners, remember that stories are how you learn, and John's done a great job of bringing those stories to get those lessons across. John, how can people find you and learn more about you?
I'm super easy to find. If you just type John Vespasian on Google, you will find everything. You find the books, you find my blog with hundreds of free articles, you find a lot of interviews. There is also a free newsletter. Just type my name on Google, John Vespasian. Even if you spell it incorrectly, it doesn't matter, because Google will correct you. So it's super easy to find, super easy.
Okay, and we will put all the links to the book and everything in the show notes as well. And yeah, it's been great chatting with you, John.
Many thanks, Nicholas. Thanks for having me on. Bye.
All right, my pleasure.